Hello, everyone. Dr. Stevens here with a few words about what we're doing in Unit 3 of this course. We are really continuing our study of how to read literature according to the suggestions made in our text, Reading Literature Like a Professor by Thomas Foster. In this particular case, we are looking at two stories, and we're going to be applying some of Foster's ideas to those two stories. Our first story is A Wife's Story by Bharati Mukherjee, and the second one is a rather long, almost a novella story by Herman Melville. You know Herman Melville, he wrote Moby Dick, right? So Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. We'll be looking at these two stories. We'll begin with A Wife's Story. So I'm going to be talking about that in this short, I hope it'll be relatively short lecture. And we're going to be talking about it in terms of a few of the ideas that Foster offers as ways of interpreting literature. But let's get the big picture first. Foster is not saying that there is one way to interpret literature. What he does in his book is he is suggesting many of the ways in which literature can be understood. And he's not saying that one particular work of literature, whether it's Sonny's Blues, which we looked at, or A Wife's Story, which we're looking at right now, he's not saying that there's just one, there's one way to approach this story. Okay, we're going to use the Bible for Sonny's Blues, and we're going to use The Quest for La Belle Dame sans Merci, and we're going to use sex or politics for A Wife's Story. No, that's not the point. The point is that these are all approaches. These are openings, if you will. These are doorways. And we can go around knocking on these doors, opening the doors and saying, okay, does this door really let me into this story? Oh, yeah, this one does. And let me try this door over here. Oh, no, that door doesn't really let me into this story. But hey, there's a third door down the hall. Let's open that. Oh, yeah, this one seems to work as well. All right, you get the general idea. So we're looking at different ways in which we can understand a story. We scratch our heads, we read the story, we scratch our heads some more, right? And we say, I don't know what this story means, okay? So that's where we are. We say, okay, you don't understand what this story means? Try looking at it in terms of politics. Is there perhaps a political subtext, something beneath the surface of the story? This story here, A Wife's Story, seems to be about an Indian woman who's going to school in New York City, and her husband from India comes to visit her. That's on the surface, right? Oh, is there something going on below the surface there? Okay, well, let's take a look at politics, or let's take a look at sex. And the third thing that I look at then is seeing and not seeing, the whole issue of blindness. So when you go to Foster and you're working on A Wife's Story, what you want to do is look at the chapter on politics in literature, look at the two chapters on sex in literature, and then finally that chapter toward the end, I think it's called He's Blind for a Reason, All right? So that's what you're going to be doing. All right. So let me talk a little bit about those things. First of all, about the story itself. Bharati Mukherjee, not an Anglo-Saxon name, right? Okay. Not a European name. Not a name that we would normally associate with Americans, whether they're African Americans or Caucasian Americans or Native Americans or something like that. No. Mukherjee was born in India, and she was educated in India, and she came to this country. That tells you something very, very important. And it's something that you need to keep in mind as you are studying and as you are writing about, discussing, if you will, this story. And that is that Mukherjee is familiar with two cultures. She, as we say, crosses cultures. She knows the culture of her native India and its languages. She knows the culture of the United States, and she knows English very well. She writes beautiful English, all right? That's one reason she's a successful writer. So that in itself tells you two things. Number one, it tells you you can look at this story in terms of a meeting of those two cultures. What happens when the culture of India comes over to the United States, the way Pana's husband comes over to the United States, to New York City to visit her, right? Look at it in terms of that meeting of cultures. What happens when those people from those two cultures come together, right? What happens when, for example, during a bus tour, Pana and her husband encounter people from different backgrounds, right? That's a meeting of different cultures. Okay, and it's very significant, by the way, that among the people that Pana and her husband encounter are Americans from other cultures. In other words, not Native American cultures. There's a character from Hungary, for example, right? And there's a character that she suspects is from the Caribbean, and so on. All right. Okay, so meeting of cultures, that's one way in which you want to look at this story. What is being said about the differences between these cultures, and what is being said about what happens when somebody from one culture encounters another culture, encounters its institutions, encounters its customs, encounters its values, encounters its buildings, and encounters its marketplaces and tourist sites and all of those things. What happens? All right. What happens to Pana, and what happens to her husband when he encounters these things. So that's number one. All right. The fact that Mukherjee is both Indian and American tells you something about the meeting of cultures and tells you to look at the story in those terms. All right. The other thing that it tells you is that you're going to be looking at things in political terms, because you're going to be looking at the whole politics of somebody from one country learning to belong to another country. And that tells you much about politics, and politics in the most general sense, folks. We're talking about politics in terms of a society's institutional structures, its policies and law, the way it approaches things, for example, such as the status of women. Very, very important in this story in particular, right? So keep that in mind. When you are reading this story, look for that meeting of cultures and what that signifies. All right, let's talk then about those three things. I'm asking you to choose. You don't have to write about all three, but I'm asking you to look at this particular story in terms of either politics or sex or the business of blindness, of seeing things and not seeing things. And of course, you want to review those chapters in Foster in order to do that. But before I go any farther, let's make sure that we understand what this story is about. First of all, it's a first-person narrative, meaning a character in the story is telling the story. And the character in the story is Panna, P-A-N-N-A. All right, she is an Indian woman. She is telling the story of her husband's visit to her from India as she is living in New York. She is in New York. She is studying for a PhD in special ed. Okay, a very, very American thing. You know what special ed is? Special education for people who have certain challenges, right? Certain difficulties with being educated and so on. And as Panna says at the end of the story, a degree that she would never use in India, but a degree which is extremely relevant to American life. So you see something important there, right? Okay, so she is telling the story, and she's telling the story, as I say, about her husband coming over to visit her. Notice that Pana has become thoroughly Americanized. She is, as we might say sometimes, she has assimilated into American culture very well. She understands it. She knows how to walk the streets of New York. She knows how to shop the streets of New York. She knows how to go to the cinema and so on, right? So she knows America. Her husband is just the opposite, all right? America is a strange land to him. Keep that in mind. All right. Not going to take any more time talking about the story itself. I will point out that at the very end of the story, the husband goes back to India. Pana decides to stay in New York and complete her degree. Let's talk then about politics in literature. The main idea is quite simple. The main idea is that a story can very often be more deeply understood if we look at the way it is commenting, either explicitly or very often not explicitly at all, but implicitly commenting upon the society in some particular way. It is commenting, as I mentioned earlier, politics having to do with the society's institutions, its customs, its values, its policies, certainly its government, but not just its government. Okay? So all of those things that apply broadly to the way a society works, okay, that's political. So Foster gives you several examples of politics in literature. He begins with the famous story of Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, right? Okay, he begins with that story, and he points out that the miser, Ebenezer Scrooge, at the center of that story is not what he calls an anomaly. Scrooge is not an exception. Scrooge represents certain tendencies in human nature, and in particular, he represents the way those tendencies played out in England in the middle of the 19th century. What he's doing is he's looking at Scrooge's attitude toward work. He's looking at Scrooge's attitudes toward money and wealth, all right? And he is seeing something in Scrooge about the way England treats its poor, okay? So political in that sense. Okay, sex, as Foster points out, sex in literature is very often not just about sex. I'm going to bring sex and politics together here by way of, I think, a very simple and easy example of what I'm talking about, and we'll go back to the story. Now, there are many references to sex in the story. I ask you to look at them, but I ask you to look at them in particular from, again, a political point of view. So you could combine politics and sex in your answer, although you don't have to. All right? But let's look at what sex has to say about the status of women. Because one of the things the story is doing is it's looking at the way in which sex does reflect the status of women. Now, in Indian culture, to really simplify it, a woman belongs to her husband. She is there to satisfy her husband, right? Her job is to please him, to cook for him, and so on. What does Pana discover in the United States? Well, one thing you can discover, what she discovers is said in what she's doing in the United States to begin with, right? She's in the United States to earn a professional degree, all right? She's a career woman. Okay, so this tells you a lot about her status. So what then does sex have to do with her status? At the very end of the story, look at what happens. Husband and wife, two Indian people, are in bed together, They are getting ready to make love. The husband gets up and goes into the bathroom. He's out of the room, right? The wife is there naked, waiting for her husband to return. What's the situation? She is all alone, right? She is then independent. She looks at herself in the mirror. She admires herself, her naked body in the mirror. Do you see then a connection here between sex and a woman's independence? She's not thinking about her husband, right? She's not even thinking about what the encounter, the sexual encounter between the two of them will be like. She is looking at herself as an individual. Sex in literature. It's not just about sex. In this particular case, I'm suggesting that you look at the way in which sex in a wife's story is commenting upon the status of women in American society. Finally, seeing and not seeing. I recommend that chapter. He's blind for a reason, you know. And Foster draws upon the great example of Sophocles' tragedy Oedipus Rex, about the man who murdered his father and married his mother without knowing it, and thought that he was in control of the situation as king of Thebes, only to discover that he wasn't in control of the situation, that he didn't see who he really was until the very end. All right, he was blind to who he was. Okay, very important. Very important. So, seeing and not seeing. Look at what the husband sees in the story. He sees things in the marketplace. He goes along the streets of New York and he sees things to buy, and he buys all kinds of things. Look at what he thinks of these things. To us, they might seem ordinary things that we take for granted, right? Whether it's a plastic toy or a piece of fruit, or it's a microwave oven or something like that. And the husband is fascinated with these things. Look at what he is seeing about American culture. Look at whether he understands what he is seeing. He sees a microwave. Does he understand? Does he really see the role of the microwave in American culture and so on? What is he seeing? What then, when he sees these things, is he not seeing? And last point I want to make about seeing and not seeing, go back to that scene at the very, very end of the story where Panna is looking at herself in the mirror. Okay? I said that scene has what? Political significance. 2, it has significance about the status of women beyond sex. And number 3, it has a lot to do with seeing. Look at the way in which Panna sees herself. Now, I'm not going to try to tell you what she sees. She sees a great deal. Okay? But ask yourself, well, when she looks in the mirror, right, she sees her body, and her body is mentioned, her thighs, her breasts, and so on. Okay, these are the things she literally sees. But she is seeing more than that, isn't she? Okay? So what else is she seeing besides her body? And then, an even more important question, what might she not be seeing? Very important, okay? What does Panna see? What does she not see? Seeing and not seeing. Sex, it's not always just about sex, and it's political for a reason, okay? Okay, literature is about politics very often. So use those 3 ways of seeing this story, decide which one works best for you, write about it in discussion, and good luck. I look forward to seeing what you have to say.